popular, common mentality of a lot of people, a lot of the Malays, people who now pass as Malays in the Malay Peninsula. Now, historically, of course, the Malay Peninsula was basically divided into a number of sultanates. After the fall of Malacca in 1511, there emerged a number of prominent sultanates extending all the way up to the west coast that claimed to be the inheritors of the mantle of the Malaccan Sultanate. This included Pahang here, Johor, Johor Riau, Terengganu, Perak, and Kedah, and Kedah. Now, prior to the arrival of colonial rule, these states, you would have the classic sort of top-down, centralized, feudal Malay royalty. You would have, for example, in the case of Johor in particular, a Malay kingdom where the king basically assumes the title of defender of the faith. You have state patronage of religion. And in the case of Johor in particular, you have a royal household, the Johor household, not only serving as the custodian and guardian of the faith, but also as the official patron of a particular tariqah, the Sufi tariqah, Naqshbandis. Naqshbandia became, for instance, the official tariqah of the Johor kingdom for a long period. You get to read this in the Hikayat Jauhari, the Hikayat of Johor. In the other Malay states, you have basically similar models at work because they're all modeled on the Malaccan Sultanate. A centralized power that diminishes the further away you move from the center, fluid boundaries between the states, a case of marginal fluid zones in between states, but basically a religious authority in the hand of the Sultan. Of course, historically, the Malay Sultans then had very close contact with the other quote-unquote Malay Muslim sultans of Sumatra, and further broad contact with Muslim rulers in India, extending all the way to Turkey. Now, something begins to change, of course, with the early arrival and consolidation of colonial rule. In the case of Malaya, British colonial rule. Historically, the process of colonization came step by step. It began with Penang, taken over by Francis Light, and then later on Malacca, and then Singapore. Now, this is when the rupture begins. The colonial process, the process of colonizing Malaya itself, began with the creation of what was then called the Straits Settlements. I'm having problems with pen.
Does anyone have a pen?
Yes.
Can I have a
Siska?
No, I was actually I had before that.
All right, okay, it doesn't matter. Now, the Straits Settlements are created one by one, and they are modeled over the settlements that we see in the coastal colonies in India as well. What the Straits Settlements of Penang, Malacca, and Singapore were basically cosmopolitan spaces. They were actually ruled under British colonial law, which basically meant that they were ruled under secular law. So for the first time in Malaysian history, you had these new spaces, these new territories that were actually no longer ruled by the Malay kings, but also not ruled under Islamic law. Now, this caused a rupture of sorts in the mindset of the Malays, for whom this was an anomaly. The reaction to the creation of the state settlements came in the form of basically political resistance, but it also sparked off what would later flower into religious resistance. It's interesting to note that the first declaration of jihad in Malaysia took place in Penang, when the Sultan of Kedah, after ceding Penang to Francis Light, 10 years later regretted the action, having realized that he had lost this important strategic port. But in order to reclaim Penang, his letter that was sent out, the Sultan of Kedah, Sultan Abdullah's letter that was sent out to the people of Kedah, but also the people of the other neighboring Malay Muslim states, including those in Sumatra, was couched in the form of an appeal to jihad. It was an appeal to, quote-unquote, rid Penang of kafir rule. This is, as far as I know, the first articulation of the word jihad in this political context in Malay history. This comes at the early 19th century.
Which year is that?
I don't have the precise year at the moment. I'm sorry because this is off the cuff, but I'm almost certain it's in the early quarter of the 19th century. It's around 1820s. You can get back to me on that. I'll give you my email after this. I can double check that for you. Now, what is interesting is that then you have this rupture. And this rupture, I suppose, brings about some sort of societal change among the Malay Muslims of the West Coast. Remember, everything I'm discussing now just applies to the West Coast because, again, we have this part of the Malay Peninsula entirely isolated. I'll get back to what's happening in Kelantan, Melani, and Malatiwan later. But for now, our focus will be here on the West Coast of the peninsula. Now, by 1850s, the state settlements are more or less consolidated. They are ruled centrally.